So good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's the end of May, 26th of May, and we are again in a meeting of Ma'avarim, the historical program, the history of academia in Israel, but also generally. And it's my pleasure to host you and our distinguished guest, Johan Östling, who is a historian at Wallenberg Academy and Wallenberg Academy Fellow at the Department of History at Lund University. He's director of the Lund Centre for History of Knowledge, LAC. Östling research encompasses various aspects of the modern European university, in particular the history of knowledge. He's doing history of knowledge, intellectual history, and the history of course, the university. His recent publication include Humboldt and the Modern German University from 2018. This is the topic of our talk today. Circulation of Knowledge, again at 2018. Forms of Knowledge, 2020. And Histories of Knowledge in Postwar Scandinavia, 2020. So thank you very much, Johan, for offering us this talk. This is much appreciated, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Please, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to present my work. I think I will start trying to share my screen, which often is the case. Just a minute.
Good, it goes well.
Yes. Just a minute, I will adjust it.
I have been there.
You have been there. Good. I think I will just 1 minute and I will.
Don't worry. This is the Platz in Berlin. Very impressive Platz.
Yes, exactly. Can you see my yes. Image, my PowerPoint? Yes. Excellent. Let's start then. Yes, as I mentioned, thank you so much. And I will talk about Humboldt and the modern university. And I will, of course, start in Berlin, a city that perhaps is somewhat familiar for some of you at least. And if you have visited Berlin, I do think that you have been walking along Unter den Linden here from Museumsinsel towards Brandenburger Tor. After leaving Museumsinsel, you often pass on the left-hand side the Berlin State Opera and the Bebelplatz, and opposite to them on the right-hand side, the German Historical Museum, the Neue Wache Memorial, and the Berlin State Library. This can be seen, for those who wish to do so, as a kind of German national nexus, a focal point for historical moments and events. And in this part of the city, more precisely at Unter den Linden number 6, we also find the main building of the Humboldt University of Berlin. And inside the entrance hall to the visitor encounters a quotation from one of the former students, Karl Marx. And moving up the stairs, these stairs to the first floor, a visitor finds photographs of German Nobel Prize winners who were affiliated with the German Capitals University. Scholars and researchers like Albert Einstein, Werner Heisenberg, Theodor Mommsen, Max Planck, Erwin Schrödinger, and some other 20 prominent scientists who belong to this group. And almost all of them worked here during the early decades of the 20th century. And as impressive as this list is, the lacuna of names after 1933 are moving in equal measure. So the history of the University of Berlin reflects very much the modern German history. And Humboldt University, and let's have a look at that again, is a university that is very central in the history of German science, German scholarship, German higher education. And how to tell this story? Well, one way is to tell the story of two brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt. And if we start with Alexander von Humboldt, with the younger of them, he was born in 1769, and during his lifetime, he died in 1859. He was definitely the most famous of the two brothers. He was a polymath, a naturalist, a geographer, an explorer, and he traveled extensively in the Americas and Russia. His work laid the foundation for entire fields of natural sciences. And when he died in 1859, he was celebrated as one of the greatest minds ever. His name was invoked great enthusiasm in both the New World and the Old World. And more species were named after Alexander von Humboldt than after any other human being. However, his fame started to fade by the end of the 19th century in international science, but he continued to be an important point of reference in Germany. And in the 20th century, the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung was important, for example, to promote international academic cooperation, especially after the Second World War. And today, he has been rediscovered the last decades as a person who had a kind of holistic perspective, a holistic perception of the universe and nature, and he's seen as a kind of pioneer in a global age. And he was one of the first person to describe the human-induced climate change, it is argued. And we can here see, for example, the very popular new biography by Andrea Wolf published a couple of years ago, The Invention of Nature, which I very much recommend. So Alexander, he was a great figure in German intellectual and culture history, and lived for many years in Berlin. But if we are interested in the modern German university and its transformations, we have to look to the other brother, Wilhelm, and his ideas and his legacy. He was the man behind the creation of the University of Berlin when it opened in 1810. So let's turn to the other brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt. And when doing that, I will build on the book that David mentioned from 2018, Humboldt and the Modern University, which I published with Manchester University Press. And this book is available open access. So if you have an interest in this theme, you can find this book in a digital version online. So I can recommend to do that if you have an interest in this topic which I will be talking about now. But let's go back to 1810. Why then a university in Berlin? What was the background? Well, to give you a brief introduction, I can say that at the end of the many scientists of the day and the emerging middle classes in the cities also thought it was a very old-fashioned institution. So the basic question was, at this time, at the turn of the century, around 1800, should the university be dismantled and abolished, or should it be reinvigorated? And in the German-speaking area, a kind of philosophical debate began about the university that involved many of the brightest minds of the age, including Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and Friedrich Schleiermacher. And they argued in favor of a kind of revitalization of the university as an institution. The university should not only disseminate old truths, as it had done since the Middle Ages. Instead, research, education in the form of what the German called Bildung, and academic freedom have to be stressed more, they argued. And one of the key figures here was this man, the other brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt. He belonged to those who had been inspired by the philosophical debate about the university And during only 16 prolific months, from February 1809 to June 1810, he was responsible for Prussia's cultural and educational affairs. He was born in 1767 in Potsdam, in a kind of noble family, and together with his brother Alexander, he received a thorough and for the nobility typical education provided by private tutors. He studied for a short while in Göttingen and Frankfurt an der Oder, and in Göttingen he learned the combination of Enlightenment ideas and some kind of early Romantic ideas that had a lasting impression on him. But after just a couple of terms, semesters, he then went on a tour in Western Europe before he joined the Prussian government service. But after that, after just a couple of years, he resigned, settled in the small city of Jena, where he cultivated his philosophical and philological interests. But after that, he went back to civil service, for example, as in a period or during a period as a diplomat in Rome. But thereafter, he was recalled to the Prussian capital and he was appointed minister in the Reform Cabinet, so responsible for the educational affairs in 1809. And his efforts was at that time to try to revitalize the whole Prussian educational system, from the primary school over the gymnasium to the university. So one way of doing that was to really install or build a new university, which he proposed in 1809. And in October 1810, teaching and research in Berlin could start. So that is the basic story about Wilhelm von Humboldt. But for the sake of the university history, his ideas are more important than his person. So now we can have a look at this, which is very much his most important document, his most important paper, a short unfinished paper, roughly 10 pages, published either in 1809 or 1810. Scholars argue still on what year it was written. And it's called in German Über die innere und äußere Organisation der höheren wissenschaftlichen Anstalten in Berlin. A short paper that comprises many of the key ideas that later would be synonymous with the Humboldtian tradition. And this is, of course, also available in English translation. So what were the key ideas? Well, I think you can sum them up in this way. First, and perhaps foremost, Bildung, the German term of Bildung, should be an important concept in this new university idea. This is an old German concept, but for Humboldt, he managed to integrate this idea into a kind of educational program and put that on an institutional footing. For Humboldt, Bildung was the furthest and most harmonious development of man's inherent abilities. It was, I repeat, the furthest and most harmonious development of man's inherent abilities. So he emphasized this very much, and he also emphasized the importance of wide-ranging studies in languages, history, and mathematics. But he also had strongly influenced by the idea of neo-humanism during this period. So that should be a core idea. Secondly, Wissenschaft, what the German called Wissenschaft, which is both a combination of science and scholarship in English. So, and alongside Bildung, the notion of Wissenschaft was a cornerstone in Humboldt's concept of the university. And in this paper from 1809, 1810, it was a self-evident link between them. Humboldt stated that the university should be the place of scholarship, that is Wissenschaft, in its deepest, widest, and purest sense. And this is also can be at least partly translated to this concept to what we called research. It shouldn't be just education in terms of disseminating old truth, but also a kind of active knowledge process that is very much what we later have been calling research. Thirdly, a third point, which has been important in Humboldt's program, is the advancement of academic freedom. And he has different ideas of what this should comprise. One important concept is what in German is called Lernfreiheit, the student's right to determine an individual course of study. And secondly, the other concept is Lehrfreiheit, which is the professor's right to determine the content and topic of the course. But he also stressed that academic freedom should mean freedom from the state, that the university should have some kind of autonomy in terms of its relation to the state. The fourth point is the unity of research and teaching, Einheit von Forschung und Lehre. He didn't use this concept himself, but the very idea belonged to the Humboldtian tradition. And finally, the community of teachers and students. Humboldt proposed a kind of intellectual fellowship, including both lecturers and students. And here, the seminar was an important arena where the students and the professors could meet and take part in a kind of jointly organized knowledge process. That was his idea. So these were the basic principles that later was associated with Humboldt's name. However, and at the same time, the Humboldtian tradition is much richer than that, and it cannot be narrowed down in this way in a few points. It has to be related to Germany's history, Germany's dramatic history, and the transformation of this tradition also reflects Germany's dramatic history in the 19th and 20th centuries. So let's continue with the history. And what we can say here is that Humboldt, he died in 1835. He was then hailed as a statesman, as a writer, as an educational reformer. But in fact, he was never really a point of reference in 19th century German discussion on the university. His fame came later in the 20th century, and I would argue definitely in the post-war period after 1945. His program, for example, his programmatic texts remained unknown or were simply left unpublished. However, what we can see here, and you see a picture of the University of Berlin, which was renamed the Friedrich Wilhelms Universität, and here you can see a picture from the mid-19th century, the 1850s, and during this period we experience a kind of crystallization of a particularly German model of the university, what has been called the modern research university. And during the German Empire, and that is from 1871 and onwards, this model became an export success and something that was adopted in many parts of Europe and North America. For example, Johns Hopkins University, founded in the mid-1870s in Baltimore, that became the first American university to explicitly aim for a kind of unity of academic training and scholarly research, very much inspired by American young scholars and researchers who have been to Berlin and other universities in Germany, and they went back and inspired a kind of reformulation of the American idea of the university. And after this, in the late 19th century, many other big, important American universities were remodeled after this kind of German idea. But if we go back to the German part of the story, it was in the last year of the 19th century when Humboldt's idea really was, for the first time, picked up. It was actually discovered by a historian who found an unpublished manuscript, this text which I mentioned from 1809 to 1810, that was really had been unpublished for almost 100 years, and then a historian found it in an archive, and this paper was brought into the center of the turn of the century debate of the German universities, especially when the University of Berlin celebrated its centenary in 1910. So it was really much debate, particularly in certain Prussian academic circles during the early part of the 20th century. And this kind of Humboldtian renaissance during this period, let's have a look here, was very much also related to the development in the German Empire in the decades leading up to the First World War. And this was a dynamic phase in which scholarship, education, and historical writings became essential components in the cultural identity that was being formed in the still quite young German nation state. And Humboldt's texts could not only serve to promote education and academic freedom during this period, it was just as much use to justify the increasing importance according to research during this period. The university became a matter of national importance during this period. And if we look at the 20th century, or the rest of the 20th century, here we can see perhaps unter den Linden, sorry. Yeah, we will come that in a minute. But before that, I would say that Humboldt, or at any rate, the classical German university model, to a greater or lesser extent associated with his name, became an important reference point in discussions about higher education and research throughout the 20th century. In the 1920s, for example, the Minister for Culture and Education, Karl Heinrich Becker, referred to Humboldt, while also arguing that the university must be adopted to the demands of a new democratic age. So here he used Humboldt to promote social sciences and democracy. For the Nazis, on the other hand, they, of course, didn't waste much time on academic freedom or personal Bildung. The university's ideologies of the Third Reich instead demanded that research and education should be subordinated to the demands of the racial nation, the racial state. And here you can see a picture from March 1942. So still the German tradition, the German university buildings, the German intellectual legacy played an important role for the Nazis in their propaganda, but of course not in the way that Humboldt had imagined. But let's continue here very much to the post-war period, which is in fact what I deal with quite a lot in my book, the post-war period, especially those periods of reform in the late 1940s and also later on in the 60s. But after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, after the destruction of the German state and nation, everything horrible during these years, we can see some kind of resurrecting of the Humboldtian ideas in Germany after, well, in the aftermath of the war, in the second half of the 1940s. And the immediate post-war period saw a quite intense debate on the idea of the university. To some extent, these discussions were part of the profound soul-searching over the German legacy, what the German calls a kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that followed the fall of National Socialism. But these discussions also drew on a long German tradition of deliberations of the university's key mission and character, going back to the early part of the 19th century. And one of the most important figures in this debate was this man, Karl Jaspers, the philosopher, in the late 1940s. And in a series of speeches and articles and books, he expounded on how the universities would be best be regenerated and what shape the ideal of the university should take after the great catastrophe. And he argued, for example, in this book, as you can see, Die Idee der Universität, that Germany should really try to find uncompromised traditions after these years, 1933 to 1945. We have to look, he argued, and many others argued in a similar way, for a kind of uncompromised German tradition, going back to the 19th century, looking at what can we find that haven't been compromised by the Nazi atrocities. In this way, he also thought that a kind of reformulation of the German national identity could take place. And one important dimension here was the regeneration of the German university. And he also very much stressed, drawing on this German Humboldtian tradition, he also very much stressed academic freedom, the need of academic freedom, and definitely a kind of autonomy from the state, which had shown its character as a kind of totalitarian state. So he also very much emphasized the importance of pure science. Humboldt as a man or as a name was not so much important point for Jaspers, but he referred very much to the tradition of the 19th century. So if we just briefly take a look at the following decades, we can see that the Humboldtian tradition underwent a kind of transformation during this period after the 1950s. And of course, in the 1960s, the German universities, the West German universities, just like the universities in many other parts of the world, experienced a radical change. The rise of the mass university is one way of describing it. And Humboldt could still, during this period, be invoked as a kind of living ideal, as did, for example, Helmut Schelsky, one of the big sociologists during this period. And in his book, Einsamkeit und Freiheit from 1963, in the middle here, he spelled out his vision, very much drawing actually on Humboldt and the Humboldtian tradition. And this book attracted much attention. And he returned to Humboldt to reformulate the idea of the university in a time of expansion, in the time of the mass university. At the same time, other voices, critical democratic alternatives to the existing university system were launched, and many German traditions, including Humboldt's, were subject to debate in the late 1960s. And if we continue even further, closer to our own age, we can see that around 2000, or the early years of the 21st century, the German university and the Bologna Process became the subject of extensive discussion. The Bologna Process to create a kind of common European market and a room and arena for education, and harmonizing the system within this arena. And during this period, the early part of the 21st century, the first year, the tide of discussion ran at times very high. International reports created a widespread feeling of crisis in Germany, since the German university was universally thought to have been left behind. And as we can see here, there were strikes and protests, and many books were also published on this theme, the future of the university. And in all these books, more so than ever, I would argue, Humboldt served as a kind of compensatory purpose, a corrective to the market-oriented mood of the age. And we can see titles such as University Only Future, University Without Future, Universität ohne Zukunft, The Unbeloved University, and Humboldt's False Legacy. and everything had to do with the contemporary interpretation of Humboldt and how this legacy could be something that could be mobilized in the current debate, or then current debate, on the Bologna Process and the reformulation of the idea of the university. And to just give you an idea of the content of these books, I can mention that in many of them, we can see a massive inflation in the number of references to the name Humboldt, often with a quite unclear meaning. Not everybody who had who referred to Humboldt had really read him. Also, Humboldt is seen as a kind of alternative vision in a time of marketization of higher education, as a symbol, very much detached from his historical role. The Humboldtian model is also seen as a kind of antipodal point of today's academic instrumentalism. And moreover, Humboldt is seen as a kind of remedy against the marginalization of the humanities. And finally, Humboldt is very much detached from its Prussian or even German origins, and not at all in the way that Jaspers or Schelsky in the early part of the post-war period did when they put him into a long tradition of German thought. So, of course, one can reflect on the realism and scope of these ideas, these ideals, which are associated with Wilhelm von Humboldt during the early part of the 21st century. And it's obvious that the university that he and his contemporaries evoked only to a very limited extent and with significant delay could be realized. That's right. But we can also ask if there are any inherent limitation in Humboldt's idea. Could we really think about it and use it for our own purposes today? The concept of Bildung, for example, that was so central to him, presupposes perhaps a kind of idealistic view of the human being that almost, or at least not very many today, really embraces. The university that he promulgated was also very much an elitist aristocratic institution, very far away from the egalitarian democratic university that emerged in the post-war period. And finally, in a broader perspective, I think, however, that is fascinating to notice when we look at the German debate in the early part of the 21st century, that how this idea is formulated by Prussian aristocrats more than 200 years keep coming back and is reformulated in other contexts, in another societal setting. And I think it will continue to come back, at least in Germany, but also in other parts of the world, as a point of reference, for good and for bad. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Johan. And I welcome comments from the audience, questions. Anyone wants to start? If not, I will start with a question about, if I got you right, you are speaking about the use and abuse or potential abuse of Humboldt. And you mainly refer to Europe or to European scene. I was under the impression that is also the idea of Humboldt as the originator of the university, and the importance of his ideas is also widely accepted in North America. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that. But beyond that, and I imagine I'm asking a big question, is what